What's up, everyone? Normal Christians Podcast. My name is Bo. As always, I reserve the right to get smarter. And today, I'm going to talk to you about why facts, in fact, don't change our minds. Let me repeat that. I kind of butchered it. And, well, I added a little part that really wasn't in there. This morning, or not this morning, this afternoon, whenever you're listening to it, I'm going to talk to you about why facts don't change our minds. In other words, even though facts might be against what we believe, we still, very often, as humans, refuse to change our minds. And so the question kind of follows, why is that the case? What is the reason? And I'll get into some of that, or at least what I read kind of laid out as to why that would be the case. But I saw this article, and I thought it was fascinating, because who is living in this world right now, or at least this country, I should say, and isn't convinced that truth and facts and reality in a lot of ways is sometimes ignored for just what we want to believe, or the belief that we've held on to, or just whatever some people want to make up and just choose to hold on to. So this was a New Yorker article, and the title was Why Facts Don't Change Our Minds, and the subtitle was New Discoveries About the Human Mind Show the Limitations of Reason. Now, this was written in 97, or maybe even not 97, 2017, I believe, and maybe even a little bit earlier, some of the stuff it's talking about. So I'm sure there's new things. Don't yell at me about new studies. I don't know. But what I liked about this article was that it went over a bunch of studies. So I'm going to kind of go over some of the studies that the article went over. And I'm a little bit of a nerd in that these psychological, sociological studies of this nature just fascinate me, because I think it reveals something about us as humans, as people, and how we are in a lot of ways. So this first study, it said, in 1975, researchers at Stanford invited a group of undergraduates to take part in a study about suicide. They were presented with pairs of suicide notes. In each pair, one note had been composed by a random individual, the other by a person who had subsequently taken his own life. The students were then asked to distinguish between the genuine notes and the fake notes. So you have these students, two sets of notes. One, a real set of suicide notes, the other, just completely made up. Some students discovered that they had a genius for the task. Out of 25 pairs of notes, they correctly identified the real one 24 times. Others discovered that they were hopeless. They identified the real note in only 10 instances. As is often the case with psychological studies, the whole setup was a put-on. Though half the notes were indeed genuine, they'd been obtained from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, the scores were fictitious. The students who'd been told that they were almost always right on average were no more discerning than those who had been mostly wrong. So in the second phase of the study, the deception was revealed. The students were told that the real point of the experiment was to gauge their responses to thinking they were right or wrong. This, it turned out, was also a deception. Finally, the students were asked to estimate how many suicide notes they had actually categorized correctly, and how many they thought the average student would get right. At this point, something curious happened. The students in the high score group said that The students in the high score group said that they thought they had, in fact, done quite well, significantly better than the average student, even though, as they'd just been told, they had zero grounds for believing this. Conversely, those who'd been assigned the low score group said that they thought that they had done significantly worse than the average student, a conclusion that was equally unfounded. So what you had there, to catch you up if you didn't understand as I read that, was this group, two sets of suicide notes, one real, one fake, and the students were to pick the real one out of the students were given all the notes, and they were supposed to pick if this was a real note or a fake note. And then you had two groups of people. One group was told they got about 24 of the 25 right. Extraordinary. They have a knack for picking out the real notes. But then in another group, they said they only got 10 right. Very bad. But then the researchers came in the second part of the study and said, hey, that was all a lie. we completely fabricated the amount that you actually got right. Because in fact, they didn't tell the students this, in fact, there was really no deviation. Everyone was about the same in choosing the real notes. But they went to these two groups and said, hey, we completely made up your score. So, now, tell us how many you think you actually got right compared to how an average student would do it. And oddly enough, the people who were told that they did exceptionally well, 24 out of 25 notes correct, they still scored themselves as doing well. They thought that they would do better than the average student. And those who were told that they did pretty bad, they scored themselves below average compared to the regular students. So it was interesting. There was this quote, once formed, the researchers observed dryly, the impressions are remarkably perseverant. So what it's showing is, once someone got convinced of something, in this case, as a student, you are good at picking a real suicide note compared to a fake one, then this student held on to that idea, even despite the fact that they were told, matter-of-factly, that their score was completely made up. It could have been any number. It didn't matter. It was just completely made up. They still held on to the fact that they were going to be better at choosing notes than the average person. And then on the other side of that, those who were told they did poorly, right? Completely made up. They didn't do any poorly more than other people. That wasn't told to them, but in reality, that was the case. They still ranked that they would do poorly compared to the average students. Fascinating. Once something gets into our heads, it really perseveres. It doesn't go away easy, despite the reality that a blunt fact was given to them that this skill they thought they had was completely made up. It's completely just made up for the experiment. They were told this. Didn't make a difference. And then there was another study a few years later, and this time the groups were asked to make judgments about some firefighters based on limited information. The information was given to the participants and was later revealed that it was completely made up. So in the study, right, again, two different groups, or some different groups, they got some information about firefighters, and they made some decisions, they did some things, again, came back and said, hey, all of this, everything you just read, everything about these firefighters was completely made up, just completely false. Then the researchers asked the group to make a judgment about the firefighters with this new information, that everything they read about the firefighters was completely false. So they were given this information, they made these judgments, found out everything they based their judgments on was completely false. Now they were being asked to make new judgments, and surprisingly, the participants still fell in line, for the most part, with their original assessments. So even after evidence, this is what the article says, even after evidence for their beliefs being totally refuted, people failed to make appropriate revisions in those beliefs, the researchers noted. In this case, the failure was, quote-unquote, particularly impressive, since two data points would never have been enough information to generalize what these people were making judgment about the firefighters from. And in the article says that reasonable seeming people are often totally irrational. Rarely has this insight seemed more relevant than it does right now. Still, an essential puzzle remains. How did we come to this way? So I think that line's important. You have people who are just rational people, maybe even smart people, but these studies keep showing that once something gets into our minds, once we make a judgment, once we believe something, it is very difficult to get that out. So why is that the case? Again, two different studies. Both groups were told that they were handed completely false information, completely made up, but they still fell in line with the information that was fake. The judgment group I didn't really get into because I didn't want to read this whole podcast, but they made judgments about these firemen off of fake information, just completely fake. And yet, having been told that, they still fell in line, for the most part, with that information. And that's why the researcher said it was particularly impressive that that was the case, considering they were told it was completely made up. So again, why is that the case? From the article, in a book, The Enigma of Reason, from Harvard Press, I assume. The cognitive scientists Hugo Mercer and Dan Sperber take a stab at answering the question. If you've listened to the podcast, you know I'm terrible with names, pronouncing them. So I have no idea if that's their names, old Hugo and Dan. But Sperber and Mercier, whatever it is. The article says, stripped of a lot of what might be called cognitive science-ese, Mercer and Sperber's arguments run more or less as follows. Humans' biggest advantage over other species is our ability to cooperate. Cooperation is difficult to establish and almost as difficult to sustain. For any individual, freeloading is always the best course of action. Reason developed not to enable us to solve abstract logical problems or even to help us draw conclusions from unfamiliar data. Rather, it developed to resolve problems posed by living in collaborative groups. So these two scientists, if you will, they say that the reason for this is that we as humans are very cooperative. That is how we have such a big advantage over other species. And so, what happens as a result is that cooperation is very important. And cooperation, as I said, is difficult to establish, and it's certainly difficult to maintain. So in other words, in their view, reason really comes to the forefront in us, in a lot of ways, not for us to solve these complex or unfamiliar problems, but instead to ultimately navigate this different cooperation, to navigate these social circles and these social hierarchies, whatever they are. It developed to solve problems in these different groups. So that's why. And the article goes on to talk about confirmation bias, which is the tendency people have to embrace information that supports their beliefs and reject information that contradicts them. Of the many forms of faulty thinking that have been identified, confirmation bias is among the best cataloged. It's the subject of entire textbooks worth of experiments. One of the most famous of these was conducted again at Stanford. For this experiment, researchers rounded up a group of students who had opposing opinions about capital punishment. Half the students were in favor of it and thought it deterred crime. The other half were against it and thought it had no effect on crime. The students were asked to respond to two studies. One provided data in support of the deterrence argument, that is, capital punishment does deter crime, and the other provided data that called it into question. Both studies, you guessed it, were made up, again, completely made up, and had been designed to present what were, objectively speaking, equally compelling statistics. So these researchers, again, made up these studies and tried to balance it out to where ultimately the information that was given was equal to both sides. The study was really not leaning one way or the other, or the studies in general. The students who had originally supported capital punishment rated the pro-deterrence data highly credible and the anti-deterrence data unconvincing. The students who'd originally opposed capital punishment did the reverse. At the end of the experiment, the students were asked once again about their views. Those who started out pro-capital punishment were now even more in favor of it. Those who'd opposed it were even more hostile. So again, another fascinating study, this around confirmation bias, but once again getting back to why don't we change our minds? And so what happened, again, as I just said, students come in, two different views, some studies are handed to them, completely made up, but they're balanced, and the people who came in for capital punishment left even feeling stronger about it. The ones who came against it, again, they left stronger against it. They even thought the studies that were on their side were more convincing than the others were. Just fascinating how strong this confirmation bias is. It's fascinating how strong this reality or this tendency that our mind has that when we're convinced of something or when we believe it, we just hold on to it. And the article continues. Imagine, these scientists suggest, a mouse that thinks the way we do. Such a mouse, and a quote here, bent on confirming its belief that there are no cats around, would soon be dinner. To the extent that confirmation bias leads people to dismiss evidence of new or underappreciated threats, the human equivalent of a cat around the corner, It's a trait that should have been selected against. Now, they're coming from an evolutionary perspective. You can put your pitchforks and torches down. This is a New Yorker article talking about some scientists. So whether you believe, not believe, just put that aside. It's just fascinating stuff. So getting back to it, the extent that confirmation bias leads people to dismiss evidence of new and or underappreciated threats, the human equivalent of a cat around the corner, it's a trait that should have been selected against. The fact that both we and it survive, the scientists argue, proves that it must have some adaptive function, and that function they maintain is related to our hyper-sociability. Humans, they point out, aren't randomly credulous. Presented with someone else's argument, we're quite adept at spotting the weakness. Almost invariably, the positions we're blind about are actually our own. So that was a fascinating part of the article right there. After talking about confirmation bias, the scientists are trying to figure out, well, if you would put this, again, from the natural, let's just say within an evolutionary framework here, which they're working in, you would think these traits would get pushed out because it wouldn't make sense. A mouse wouldn't be so dug into his position, his or her position, to say there is no cat around the corner. I'm going to prove it. I don't care what you say. I don't care what the evidence says. I'm just going to prove it. That mouse would be dead because the cat was around the corner. But for us as humans, we still have this, even though, without a doubt, we have faced those sort of problems. We have faced those sort of issues. So what happened? Why do we still have this within this particular framework? They say it's because our hyper-sociability. Again, this comes back to we're social creatures. We care about our groups. We care about collaboration. We care about cooperation. And they pointed out at the end, really, we have no problem at picking out other people's arguments. We have no problem hearing someone else's arguments, someone else's thoughts, and then pointing out the flaws in it. Instead, the flaws, the positions that we're most blinded to are ultimately our own. Again, once we believe it, it's really hard to let it go. It's really hard to let it go. And then a little bit more from the article. A recent experiment performed by Mercier, again, this is one of those scientists, and some European colleagues neatly demonstrated this asymmetry. Whew, butchered that word. Participants were asked to answer a series of simple reasoning problems. They were then asked to explain their responses and were given a chance to modify them if they identified mistakes. The majority were satisfied with their original choices. Fewer than 15% changed their minds in Step 2. In Step 3, participants were shown one of the same problems along with their answer and the answer of another participant who'd come to a different conclusion. Once again, they were given the chance to change their response, but a trick had been played. The answer presented to them as someone else's was actually their own, and vice versa. About half of the participants realized what was going on. Among the other half, suddenly people became a lot more critical. Nearly 60% now rejected the responses that they'd earlier been satisfied with. So another fascinating study that just keeps drilling down this fact. These people were given this set of questions. They answered them, and they were given the chance to change their minds. Okay, good. Now, in the next part of the study, they're presented the same questions with what they're told is their answer that they gave, and they're told that this other answer that they're now being given was by someone else who disagreed with them. And they were given the chance with this new information to change their mind. And while about half of the participants figured it out, the other half didn't, and were actually super critical about these other people's answers that disagreed with their own. But as you caught, if you were listening to how that study broke down, the people who put on the study played a trick on them. They actually took what their real answers were from the beginning and switched it. So in this third step, when they saw the questions and they were told, this is your answer, this is the answer you gave, it wasn't actually the answer they gave. It was someone else's answer. And then they were said, well, here's another answer that someone else gave that disagrees with the answer you gave. In reality, that other answer was the answer that they originally gave. And so what was so funny in this study was that people were super critical of what they deemed other people's answers. and instead were more for what they thought was theirs, when in reality all they were doing was criticizing their own answer that they actually gave. The only difference was they were convinced ultimately that that was someone else's answer. And that's what's so fascinating. If they are convinced that that's what they said, they will fight against it, right? And that is so important. So this continues in the article. It's a longer article. And it says, our ancestors were primarily concerned with their social standing and with making sure that they weren't the ones risking their lives on the hunt while others loafed around in a cave. There was little advantage in reasoning clearly while much was to be gained from winning arguments. So there was little advantage in reasoning clearly while much was to be gained from winning arguments. Scientists are believing that sociability is the key to how human minds function, or perhaps more pertinently in our day, malfunctions. And that was interesting. What these scientists are saying is that logic and reason are great, but how it's being used is in a social, again, cooperative group aspect. There was little advantage of just making good reasons as to why, let's say, this person should go or this person should go or all that sort of stuff. Or, laying out the facts. Instead, it seems that reason and logic was better appropriated to try to win arguments against the people in your group or the people you're cooperating with and try to convince them of your view. Whether it's right or wrong, that seems to be the better option. And so they're saying for our ancestors, you don't want to be the one going on the hunt. You want to be the one sitting in the cave or whatever it is, waiting for the food to come back. And so instead of trying to do logic and make sense in that group, to just try to convince everyone you need to stay while they need to go. And it's just so fascinating. And then one more study, I promise. I know I'm reading a lot today, but this stuff to me, at least, is just fascinating with the human mind. And it talks about two other scientists. They see this effect, which is called illusion of explanatory depth, just about everywhere. People believe that they know way more than they actually do. What allows us to persist in this belief is other people. And that's interesting right there. They're talking about this illusion of explanatory depth, which basically just says we think we know way more than we actually do. And the reason we continue to do this is because of other people. And they gave this study that I'm not going to get into, but basically these very smart kids were asked, I think Harvard, I believe that's where they were from, extremely smart, Ivy League, asked how basic things like even a toilet worked. It turned out these really smart kids, these really smart young adults, couldn't figure it out. And the reason was because someone designed it to just work. So they didn't really have to know how it worked. And so they go on to say, this is something humans are very good at. We've been relying on another's expertise ever since we figured out how to hunt together, which was probably a key development in our evolutionary history, again, from that framework. So well do we collaborate, the scientists argue, that we can hardly tell where our own understanding ends and others begins. Where it gets us into trouble, according to the scientists, is in, specifically talking about nowadays, the political domain. It's one thing for me to flush a toilet without knowing how it operates, and another thing for me to be in favor or to oppose something like, let's say, immigration, without knowing what I'm talking about. The scientists cite a survey conducted in 2014, not long after Russia annexed the Ukraine territory of Crimea. Respondents were asked how they thought the U.S. should react to Russia ultimately annexing Crimea, and also whether they could identify Ukraine on a map. The farther off base they were trying to put the Ukraine geographically, the more likely they were to be in favor of military intervention. Respondents were so unsure, actually, of Ukraine's location that the median guess was wrong by 1,800 miles, roughly the distance from Kiev to Madrid, if you know your geography. And that's fascinating. I'm nerding out on all these studies. Just so incredible. We convince ourselves we know way more than we do, despite having very little knowledge. We all know how to operate a toilet. Some of us even know maybe how it operates completely. Others, we know what happens when it's clogged. Others can lift the lid and change some stuff and all those sort of things. Whatever. We all have different varying knowledge. Some of us just press the handle and hope everything goes right? Especially when you're at someone else's house. Can I get an amen? But different story, different podcast episode. But what they're demonstrating in a very real way is this reality that we rely on other people's knowledge. Again, this gets back to the group. This gets back to the social thing. And when we're convinced of something, I definitely know how a toilet works. It's hard to say that we don't, even when presented with the facts. And so what you have is you have this example of the Ukraine and Russia annexing Crimea, where after it happened, these researchers asked people, and it turns out that the people had pretty good, really had no idea where Crimea and Ukraine even were. And the funny thing is the less they knew where it was, the more they were for, specifically in this case, military intervention and all this sort of stuff, basically pointing out that even though people couldn't even place Ukraine on a map, they had these strongly held opinions about what the results should be. They didn't even have some of the basic information that you would need to make that decision, like, where is this? What kind of effect would this have and all these things? But people were dug into their position. And they go on, this is how a community of knowledge can be dangerous at times, they observe. The two have performed their own version of the toilet experiment, substituting public policy for household gadgets. In a study conducted in 2012, they asked people for their stance on questions like, should there be a single-payer healthcare system or merit-based pay for teachers? Participants were asked to rate their positions depending on how strongly they agreed or disagreed with those proposals. Next, they were instructed to explain in as much detail as they could the impact of implementing each one of those positions. Most people at this point ran into trouble. Asked once again to rate their views, they ratcheted down the intensity so that they either agreed or disagreed less vehemently. So basically, these scientists once again approach people, say, hey, here are some big political issues. Tell me if we should implement it or not. People come out strong. Let's say they rate how strong they're for or against it. And then they ask, well, now explain it. Explain the impact of implementing the system or not implementing this system. And all of a sudden, people couldn't. And as a result of realizing they couldn't, that's whenever they began to take a less strong stance. And so, ultimately, to slowly wind down my telling you about this article, the researchers see in this result a little candle for a dark world. If we, or our friends, or the pundits on the news, spent less time pontificating and more time trying to work through the implications of policy proposals, we'd realize how clueless we are and moderate our views, I should say. This, they write, may be the only form of thinking that will shatter the illusion of explanatory depth and change people's attitudes. So they're suggesting that, at least in the political sphere, instead of just pontificating, instead of, put a different way, like you see on social media, instead of people just dug into their position, yelling at each other, taking the extremes, and saying all kinds of crazy things, really, instead of doing that, if there was actually time spent explaining things, working through the details, well, we would often move from the extremes and realize, because we realize how little we know, and we'd probably come to more agreements. But sounds good in theory. There are always hurdles, though, right? And I believe that the article gave a pretty big hurdle. These different scientists cite research suggesting that people experience genuine pleasure, a rush of dopamine, when processing information that supports their belief. It feels good, quote unquote, to stick to our guns, even if we are wrong, they observe. Providing people with accurate information doesn't seem to help. They simply discount it. Appealing to their emotions may work better, but doing so is obviously antithetical to the goal of promoting sound science or facts. The challenge that remains, they write towards the end of their book, is to figure out how to address the tendencies that lead to these false beliefs. And that's pretty much how the article ends. Obviously, I'm adding my flavor in there, but that's so important. Even when faced with facts, even when faced with reality in many different ways, even maybe figuring out they're completely wrong, people get a genuine rush of dopamine. They get genuine pleasure when they just find information that supports their beliefs, when they process it, right? It feels good, as they say, to stick to our guns. So what you have is you have this built-in confirmation bias around us. And this gets back, all boiling it down to this in a different way. We're social beings, right? Let's just boil it down. Let's get to the point of this. It's been a long time. If you stuck with me this long, you're better than most people. But, because I can talk, I have no problem with that. And this stuff fascinates me. Here's the point. We are social beings who aren't as worried about facts and truth as much as we are about our place in the world socially, or our place in the world within our groups, or whatever it is. Our place in this world socially, or our place within our groups, our social circles, our peers, those we want to associate with, whatever it is. And I think that is critical to understand, right? We just aren't as worried about facts or truth. Let's not paint with a broad brushstroke for everyone. But how can you look around and not realize that's the case? I mean, how could you not? People would face an information with facts, with true things. They just default to what they want to. They just hold on to their position. I mean, I see this so much now because I read articles from everywhere. I do all kinds of things. There's so much misinformation out there, and there's so much just propaganda out there. It's crazy. People will find one article from a news source it's on the internet. Who cares? Or some random doctor or quote-unquote expert on YouTube. No one has any way of actually knowing if this person knows what they're talking about. And because it affirms their view, they get that rush of dopamine, right? They get that hit of genuine pleasure because that supports their belief. So now, this just reaffirmed them in what they believed. Never mind, it could be completely made up. And actually, one of the recent stories I just read, and I'm not trying to get into this argument, this is just one that I read, so back off. There was this lady who had a miscarriage, unfortunately. She posted about it on Instagram. A few days later, she posted about getting vaccinated, also on Instagram. And what someone did was they took those two posts and they changed the dates to make it seem like that she got vaccinated first and then had a miscarriage shortly after. And it went viral in a sense with people who were promoting the dangers of the vaccine. Again, I'm not saying for or against. That's not the point of this. I'm just trying to say that this is one of the recent examples that I just saw of this. And the lady was obviously tremendously frustrated, vaccine stuff aside, but because she was being used in a way that's clearly false and made up. But people were sharing this. And she said, as she reached out to some people, they were super sympathetic and took it down. But she said she reached out to some people saying, hey, this is wrong. Look at my Instagram. Look at the actual facts here. And people dismissed her, or people got angry at her for different things. And it's mind-blowing. She is the person. She's sending them the actual Instagram link so that they could see the real dates instead of the thing that's being promoted as a fact. And people still push it aside. Why? Because it helped bolster their view. Again, I'm not saying for or against. That's not the point. This is just the most recent example. There are plenty of stuff on the other side too. So don't email me or all that sort of stuff about that. That's not the point of this episode. I just was blown away, and it just brought me back to this article that even given that sort of thing, people don't care. They don't care. I have it on my iPad right now. I'm going to see if I could try to find it real fast. Not that this episode isn't long enough already. You know, everyone's sure excited for me to waste more time here. But it was funny because I ran across this. It was this tweet from Decider that said, do you know that Legally Blonde originally ended with Reese Witherspoon's Elle Wood and Selma Blair's Vivian Kingston getting together? And then someone responded, Karen McCauley, that this is not true. And then someone responded to her asking for the source. And they linked a source from the New York Times explaining that view from someone there. And I just loved what she responded to that. She said, I wrote the movie. I'm in the picture you actually just posted. the actress who quoted that information was incorrect, but that cracked me up because the person who actually wrote the movie said it was wrong. And people were like, where's your source of information? She's saying, I'm the one who created it. How can you tell me that that was supposed to be the ending? Again, this woman saying, I'm the one who put this information out. How can you possibly say that I'm wrong or I'm this or that? I'm showing you the reality of it. And it's not, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to some people, and maybe a lot of people. So again, you boil it down to this. We're social creatures, and we care more about our standing in the group, our standing in our social circles, those we cooperate with, and where we're at in the world than we do about facts in a lot of ways. And this is why social media is so dangerous to the truth, because you can always find another group to go be a part of that helps share your views, where they will tell you that you're right, or they'll support you regardless of whether what you believe is actually true or not. That's what's so dangerous. And you could also just find information that's just not true. As a matter of fact, another thing, even more recent than the Instagram thing I just saw, I was on a place where someone put up a tweet that looked like it was from BBC that gave LeBron James' movie Space Jam didn't do too well. And so this tweet said, LeBron James said the reason it didn't do well was because of systematic racism. And people were freaking out. Oh, how ridiculous of a statement, all this sort of stuff. Here's the problem. That tweet that was quoted wasn't from the BBC. Though it looked exactly like it. If you actually look at the Twitter handle, it was, don't quote me on this, but I think the actual handle was BBC, but a lot gayer or something like that. That truly was the handle or something similar. So it was completely made up. They used the BBC imagery, they used the graphic, everything looked legit except it wasn't. But people were running with a narrative completely false, all because someone just had some fun on social media. But again, it was reaffirming certain views, and they were running, and it shot a dopamine pleasure at that. So what's the point? That's why we struggle changing our minds. We actually aren't into facts and truth as much as we say we are. Really, we're more into where do we stand in our social circle? Where do we stand in the group of people that we care about or we think we care about? Where do we stand with those we admire to be like or we aspire to be like? That seems to be way more important than actual truth, than actually getting things right. We seem way more interested, again, in socially cooperative sort of things. And to me, it makes perfect sense. And social media is just pushing it more and more. Don't like what these people say? Just go to this different group. And now once you're in this group, you can virtue signal and try to climb the ranks. Because, again, who cares about truth? Let me say this or do this, and then everyone cheers me on. And I've just raised my standing in the group. Going back to what the scientists said about our ancestors. Why go out and do the hard work of killing the animal and bring it back when instead you could just convince people to go do it and you don't have to do it? So again, why maybe do some real stuff when you can push forward some fake things or some half-truths or whatever it is and everyone brings you up? Anyway, I'm ranting. It's been a long episode, but I find this so crazy and it helps me understand so much, especially as I deal with people. Yes, plenty of us are swayed by facts and information. Probably all of us in some way, at some level. But so many of us, first and foremost, it's difficult. It's getting harder and harder, more and more difficult to actually get through to people, to get past the confirmation bias, to get past some of these other things. Because again, we're just social beings who aren't worried as much about facts and truth as our place in the world, our social circles, all that sort of stuff. So I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. Again, sorry it's a little longer, but it's helped me process some things about myself. It's helped me check and say, hold on, is this truth? Or am I believing this because I want to believe it? Because I'm already convinced of it at the start, and so I'm finding this to help reaffirm it. And it helps me explore different ways of thinking and being and really processing things. So I hope that was also the result for you. Or maybe you just find it fascinating. Or maybe if you've been with this episode so long, you're just at work or doing something and it's just playing in the background, you're not paying attention anymore. Wherever it is. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I had fun making it, even though it was really long. But again, wherever you're listening, however you're doing it, until next time, thank you. And 3515, have a good one. Bye.